Hello, my name is Dr. Jeffrey Barsuk. I am the Robert Herstick Professor of Medicine and Medical Education at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. I currently serve as the Executive Medical Director of Northwestern Simulation. I'd like to welcome you back to another podcast in our series on simulation and healthcare education. Today, we plan to highlight Chapter 21 on opportunities and challenges in mastery learning in our book called Comprehensive Healthcare Simulation, Mastery Learning, and Health Professions Education. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Bill McGaghie. Bill is a professor of medical education and preventive medicine. We originally interviewed Bill in our first podcast about our book introducing the topic of mastery learning. And I only think it's fit that Bill will be the final podcast in the series covering our book. Bill, as usual, it's an honor to interview you today.
Thanks, Jeff, and it's a treat to be back here for an encore performance to discuss our work on mastery learning in health professions education.
So in the original podcast, we heard a bit about your background, but for our listeners, can you remind them?
Well, sure. Just as a bit of history, I'm an old-timer in this business. I've been around for quite a while. My early training was in educational and social psychology at Northwestern, where I earned my PhD in the 70s. And I've been active in medical education research and development for over 40 years now. I've been a faculty member at 4 universities, 4 medical schools now in the United States, including the University of Illinois, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the Loyola Stritch School of Medicine, and for the longest stretch of time here at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. As I mentioned earlier, my interest in mastery learning stems from several sources. First, from a very early formative experience as a college undergraduate where mastery learning was used in an elementary statistics course that I took that had a lasting effect on me, because I wondered after that experience why all other courses were not used using mastery principles. And then secondly, from an opportunity I had as a young scholar to work with George Miller to write a little book for the World Health Organization on competency-based education, published, back in 1978, I think, and there was a major section in that book, a chapter that addressed mastery learning in the framework of competency-based education. So my interest in the field goes way back for many years. It's both broad and deep, and it's been a great run that we've had here at Northwestern in applying mastery learning principles within the context of competency-based education to a wide variety of problems, questions in health professions education, and increasingly their downstream effects in terms of patient care practices and patient outcomes.
And I think our journey started together roughly around 2004, and I know the original project was with Advanced Cardiac Life Support with Diane Wayne, our colleague, and that's really when I would say you were one of the founders of bringing mastery learning educational theory to simulation, and thus the founder of what we now term as simulation-based mastery learning.
Well, if not a founder, at least we have a great team of pioneers, of clinicians and education researchers, psychologists, and statisticians that work together to produce really fun and exciting work. Now, early on, Jeff, you asked us to focus on Chapter 21 of our book, Comprehensive Healthcare Simulation, Mastery Learning, and Health Professions Education. And I would remind you, as well as listeners to this podcast, that last chapter in the book is both a summary as well as a kind of a call to action for investigators and scientists. And I'd like to point out, just to remind the listeners, that Chapter 21 of our book lists 6 opportunities, and it also lists 7 challenges for people who would choose to labor in this vineyard. Let me review very quickly the 6 opportunities that we point out. First, to expand mastery learning curricula. It is to broaden the field, to broaden the scope, to apply this interesting technology to a wider variety of fields, including the second opportunity is in the area of patient, family, and caregiver education. And in a few minutes, we'll discuss an application of that technology in just that realm. The third opportunity is mastery learning for clinical team training. As we know, healthcare today is a team sport, and more the instruction, the education we want to provide will be directed toward teams rather than individuals. Now, the fourth opportunity addresses peer teaching and assessment, how learners in the health professions can educate and give feedback to one another. The fifth opportunity is addressing non-technical clinical skills, communication skills, breaking bad news, counseling skills, and so forth that are so vital to the clinical enterprise, but are, as a rule, are typically very poorly taught and learned. And then finally, the sixth opportunity that we lay out is the opportunity to engage in mastery learning research in its many permutations. So those are the six opportunities. Now, also within Chapter 21 of our book on mastery learning, we identify 7 challenges. And the challenges are deep, they're abiding, and they're very important for all of us to think about and address as systematically as we possibly can. The first challenge has to do with deriving better measures of complex clinical entities, complex assessment, as we call it. The second challenge is to figure out ways where we can teach and assess to a much more rigorous way the adaptive competencies that are so important for the doctors as well as the repertoires of other health professionals. So adaptive competencies are the second challenge that we need to address. The third challenge is that we need to acknowledge the limits of mastery learning. This is not a panacea. We can't teach everything. We can't test everything using this technology. It's useful within some domains, but we need to recognize that it's not useful everywhere. The fourth challenge is to address the widespread issue of evaluation apprehension. The widespread fear that we see everywhere in the health professions where professionals, both in training and certainly seasoned professionals, are petrified at the prospect of being evaluated for their clinical skills, their professionalism, in ways that might be embarrassing. And to address that, we need to constantly acknowledge the point of view that whatever assessment data, whatever assessments we conduct, the data are used as a tool and never as a weapon to humiliate people. And the only way that we can help individuals and teams become stronger, become better at what they do, is to assess their progress and provide feedback. So evaluation apprehension, a big hurdle, is the fourth challenge. The fifth challenge addresses what we call cultural and organizational questions. The built-in inertia that exists within any organization, we see it all the time in the health professions, and it can be a genuine barrier to making progress in our field. The sixth challenge has to do with new and emerging technologies. In healthcare today, just only one example is the growth and the widespread use now of artificial intelligence for training, certainly for patient care and diagnostics. These are issues that the rise of technologies that won't go away, and they pose really important as well as fascinating challenges for us who would do research on those technologies within the framework of a mastery learning context. And then finally, the seventh challenge that's been a persistent issue for all of my career, and I'm sure it will go on for many, many years to come, is the issue of funding. Who's going to pay for this research? Who's going to pay for these new innovations, despite the fact that they represent skills and issues that we should be doing anyway, just as a matter of advancing the field. It always amazes me that we have to apply for grants to do projects that we ought to do anyway as a part of our daily work. So those are the 6 opportunities. the 7 challenges that are articulated within Chapter 21 of our Mastery Learning book. And now I'll turn to Jeff because I realize he may have a question or two that he'd like to address to me. Jeff?
Well, I know that you were going to expand a little bit more on the opportunities and challenges, and I know you had a little bit of an agenda on what you wanted to talk about as far as opportunities and challenges go, but there's a lot, obviously, we could talk about in those areas, thus a book chapter that even doesn't cover it all. But one of the opportunities that you mentioned that I think is worth noting is about patient and caregiver training. And you were very involved in what we called SIMVAD, which was our simulation-based mastery learning training of patients and their caregivers on how to care for their ventricular assist devices. Ventricular assist devices, for our listeners, are implanted into the heart to help circulate blood to the body when the heart is failing. So I will give it to you, and you can let us know how you perceive that as a great opportunity.
And right you are. These patient self-care skills are so vital to the advancement of healthcare, and certainly for patient safety that's provided by the individuals and caregivers. In your VAD project, and I'd like to emphasize that this was done in collaboration with our colleague, Dr. Jane Wilcox, who is a cardiologist and heart failure specialist, but also, and in particular, in collaboration with the nursing team at the Northwestern Memorial Hospital, especially Rebecca Harrop and Kathy Grady, who exercise really great leadership in this project. And let's underscore the fact that the management of or self-care of people who have a ventricular device is really a life-saving exercise, where cleanliness, sterility is so important to keep the VAD operational and to make sure that patients don't fall ill as a consequence of poor VAD self-care. And your work with Rebecca and with Kathy and their team to educate patients and their caregivers, usually family members, about cleanliness, about maintaining the equipment, about dressing changes on a frequent basis, has had a huge impact both in the training laboratory environment, but also in terms of what we call downstream effects in terms of better patient safety, fewer infections, that sort of thing, and long-term patient outcomes. So this is a real important application of mastery learning, thinking, theory, and technology to a patient care practice that has life-saving consequences. Jeff, can you add to that?
Well, I just think that one of the most surprising things for me that resulted from that project is the actual hospital changed their policy.
Yes.
Their official policy on how they expected patients and their caregivers to be trained. And now it's written there that they must use simulation-based mastery learning curricula, just as the one we developed.
And this is a great example of what we call collateral effects, unintended consequences that derive from a mastery learning intervention that's related but targeted toward a much more focused outcome. So the collateral effects, the effects that we can't necessarily anticipate when we start a project like this, can be huge. The analogy I like to use is you drop the rock in the pond and the ripples go in many, many different directions. And in this case, the ripples are all in a very positive direction because it had a direct effect on hospital policy and in better patient care practices. So that said, in addition to the patient and family caregiver skill acquisition studies that we've done, a couple of things that I think in the area of challenges as well as opportunities that are articulated in Chapter 21 of our book have to do with real important scientific as well as practical issues having to develop measures that yield reliable data that permit valid decisions about the impact of mastery learning interventions, usually regarding very, very complex clinical skill sets. Think, for